if we're all ready, tonight's presentation is my presentation. And I'm going to talk about really long exposure photography. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And give me a little feedback here. Let me know everybody's seeing this.
Looks good.
Great. This should take about 25 minutes without comments, just in case you're wanting to plan your time. So I always like to break things down into chapters to let you know what's coming up. I'm going to first talk about some photographers who inspired me and kind of got me onto this idea. And then that led me to an artistic concept behind what it is I'm trying to achieve when I do this technique. I'm going to talk about the equipment you would need to do long exposure photography. I'm going to talk about some of the concerns when you're actually in the field doing the technique and what things you need to pay attention to. I'm going to show you some of my results without a lot of post-processing, just to see kind of what it looks like without messing with it too much. But then I'm also going to talk about a technique that is messing with it a lot, called selective gradient masking. It really does dramatic changes to the image that has already been a long exposure. And I'm going to just share with you some of my finished photographs. A photographer named Julia Anna Gaspadarou, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, she's using 5-minute exposures in that neighborhood, and you can see the sky is very creamy. She does all the pictures I'm going to show you are scenes from Chicago, and I find them very dramatic. I really like them a lot. This is a scene from Millennium Park. I love the contrast. I love the drama. You can see the movement in the sky. That's the effect of the clouds over a 5-minute movement. This is another one of downtown Chicago. Again, you see the sky becomes just a complete creamy background. And she likes to use focus a lot to draw attention. You can see a lot of the image is out of focus, but the clock is in focus. Another photographer I like a lot who does this technique, Kevin Holliday. And what I like about this is overpasses, underpasses, highways are some of the ugliest things in our environment. I mean, there are things we see every day, but when I look at this image, I see beauty in this commonplace thing. And I find myself looking at it in a very geometric way. I think that's really cool. And that's something that I wanted to try to achieve. Another one by Kevin Holliday. And here you have some water in this image, and you can see it at a 5-minute exposure just makes that water look completely flat and uniform. You've got the movement in the sky. It becomes very abstract, and was really attracted to this. Probably the photographer who influenced me the most is, I think it's Joel Gintjalar. I purchased a tutorial from him, and that's where I learned most of the technique I use. This is a nice scene from New York, again, with the very long exposure. This one, you know, when you first look at it, it almost reminds you of a waterfall, but of course we're looking up at a building. And again, just completely different perspective. It didn't occur to me at first glance that this was a building. I had to kind of think for a minute, what is this? Really like it. And this is one of my favorites by Joel Gintjalar. I first looked at this and I thought, am I looking at a harp? This looks like a musical instrument. It is looking up at a suspension bridge, with all the cables. And again, getting you to look at something in a completely new way, to me, is something that photography does really well. And the concept behind this, I kept looking for a word or a term, and I just decided to call it suspended recognition. And I've seen it, other photographers do this, but when you look at an image and you don't know at first what it is, and so you find yourself appreciating the shapes, appreciating the geometry, and then it dawns on you what it is, and then you kind of have this moment of, wow, that beauty is all around us. Only if I would look at it differently, I'd see it. Now, I did not take this picture, but just to show you that a lot of people achieve this concept through macro photography. When you first look at this image, you think it looks like some kind of an alien. It is, of course, a close-up of a dandelion seed head. And you don't know that beauty's there until you get that close-up and you start looking at it before your mind categorizes it as a dandelion seed head. You're looking at it with new eyes. That's something that I have made it a goal to try to achieve. So in those moments of suspended recognition, you're forced to look at a familiar object in a totally new way. Okay, moving on to the equipment. The filter that I use the most is this Format High-Tech. For my camera, it's a 77mm filter, 16 stop. It was 196 bucks. That's a lot of money to lay out for a filter, but I really wanted to do this effect. I also purchased the B&W 10 stop. The 16 stop is very extreme. You can really only use it in bright light. You hold that filter up to the sun and the sun just becomes a dim dot. That's how strong it is. If I ever wanted to do long exposures at sunset, I would probably, I use the 10 stop. It's a little less extreme. But for the long exposures I'm talking about, you do need filters like this. You also need a camera capable of bulb mode. We'll talk about that. Of course, a sturdy tripod, a remote shutter release. And I like to use, in addition to my ND 16 stop filter, I like to use a circular polarizing filter because it will give you more contrast in the sky. And I like that for my long exposures. Here's a chart that just shows what the different ND filters do. And so I've got arrows pointing here to, I have the 10 stop and the 16 stop. And as you can see, the 10 stop filter, if you go all the way to the right of this column, it cuts the light by more than 1/1000th. If you look at the 16 stop filter, it cuts the light by more than I got this kind of in the way here, I can't see it. It's like I don't know, maybe you can read it better than I can. I can't get my
Hey,
picture.
Dan,
Yeah,
do you ever use a variable ND filter?
I never have, no.
Any reason not to?
I'm sorry? No,
Any reason not to?
I've never tried them, so I really can't speak to them. Have
I've
you?
used them, and sometimes they create an X pattern if you're not careful.
I think that's what I read, and that may be why I avoided it. But also, as I said, I took this, I bought this tutorial from Joel Ginchelar, and he was using this 16 stop filter, so that's the one I went for. Okay, but yet they're very extreme filters. Also, when you use these filters, you need a conversion chart. And I made some little card size charts, which I keep in my camera bag so that I can gauge. What it does is it converts shutter speed without the filter to what the exposure needs to be in seconds with the filter. And I like to aim for about a 5-minute exposure. That's 300 seconds. So if my exposure without the filter is 1/200th of a second, that means I need to expose with the filter for 327 seconds. Now I go beyond 5 minutes sometimes, but again, that's just kind of what I aim for, but it all depends on the light that's available. But if you go less than 5 minutes, you're not going to get the extreme effect you're looking for. If you go too much beyond 5 minutes, you could be building up lots of noise in your image. And so 5 minutes is kind of the sweet spot, but as you will see in some of my images, I will go as long sometimes as 8 minutes, maybe even 10. But so for the technique in the field, you want to choose a windy, sunny day with blue sky and lots of clouds. Again, it depends on the effect that you want. If you want a lot of contrast, a very streaky sky, then you want both blue in the sky and the cumulus or cirrus clouds. You want to set up your camera on your tripod, compose your shot. If you're using a circular polarizer, you want to set that up and maximize the contrast with your polarizer. Yeah, and you want to manipulate your aperture and ISO so that you're around 1/200th, 1/250th of a second. I also try to keep the ISO very low, again, to avoid lots of noise. So this is what cumulus clouds look like, again, but it depends on the effect that you want. If you want a more creamy look, you don't have to have all of this contrast in the sky. Lots of different looks that you might be going for. You want to set your camera to time or bulb mode. And by the way, I should probably say that you need to set up your exposure and everything before you put your filter on, because you cannot see through your filter. If you've got an SLR, you're not going to be able to see through it. So you want to put your camera to time or bulb mode. In case you're wondering why we call this bulb mode, a lot of terms in photography harken back to the pioneering days of photography. In the days of this kind of camera, the shutter was open for as long as the bulb was held. And when you release the bulb, the shutter closed. And that's in effect what you're doing when you're in bulb mode. The photographer is in complete control of the duration of the exposure. So it's under the control of the user and not under the control of whatever settings you might have put on your camera. But that's why it's called bulb mode. So again, yeah, you want to use your chart to determine, based on whatever your shutter speed is without the filter, what it needs to be with the filter. And then you need to very carefully screw that filter onto your lens. And you want to make sure while you're putting that filter on that you're not changing your focus, that you're not altering the position of the polarizing filter if you're using one. And I found this sometimes to be very tricky because sometimes those threads just don't want to catch right. But usually I don't have too much trouble. You start the bulb exposure by triggering the remote shutter release. And that's also how you stop the exposure. You watch the second count on your camera and you stop it when the designated time is up. This is tricky because the light could change in 5 minutes. A cloud could obscure the sun, completely changing your exposure. So you may have to, try several times to get the exposure you want. So this is pretty much what it might look like out of camera. This was an exposure made at 500 seconds, f8 ISO 100. Now, this was taken of the Pacific Ocean in Mexico. The waves were crashing in. it was really very turbulent wave action. And of course, in a 5-minute exposure, it just becomes very misty. Here are some of my results without too much post-processing. I was in Coney Island and just took a shot of these rides, 344 seconds at f8. This was in Lake Tenaya in Yosemite. This was a 420-second exposure at f8. You can see the water flattens out, the sky gets very creamy looking.
Dan, are these all with the 16 stop?
Yes, these are all with the 16 stop filter. This was San Pancho, Mexico. Really, again, the waves were crashing against these rocks. This was, I guess, it was more than a 10-minute exposure at f8. I think it was an overcast day. Just shows you how much that 16 stop filter blocks the light. I had to have 10 minutes to get this. Riverscape Fountain, 431 seconds. Again, the light was getting toward dusk, and I may have even upped the ISO to get this because I also used the 16 stop filter for this. Now this one, it was getting very dim. I used the 10 stop filter on this one. Honolulu Pier in Kauai, 371 seconds.
Hey, Dan, are you cranking those filters all the way up to the darkest spot when you use them?
I'm not sure what you mean. It's
You know, on the variable
it's
neutral
not.
density
I'm not
filters?
using variable filters.
Oh, you're not? Okay, so
No.
you're doing the full 16
Yes.
stops on it. Okay.
Yes. This is the Chicago skyline, 328 seconds, f8. Again, you can see the water flattening out. You can see the sailboat masts are all blurry. The effect I'm really going for, though, is a more surreal effect that I think black and white really complements the kind of effect I'm going for. So a lot of these images I like better when they're converted to monochrome. So this is that same shot in San Pancho, Mexico. I love the surreal look of this. A shot of downtown Dayton, a lot of streaking in the sky, 328 seconds. It's another shot of Lake Tenaya, Yosemite, 430 seconds. I'm going to talk now about even going further with manipulating these images. The images you saw from the photographers that I talked about, they were not only using the long exposures, but they're using a technique called selective gradient masking. It's a Photoshop technique that uses masks in the gradient tool to reveal lighter and darker gradations of the image, and it really enhances the shading. In Photoshop, you do this by creating 3 different versions of your base image. One that's maybe a stop lighter, one that's a stop low, darker, and then you stack these as layers in Photoshop. I always put the medium image on top. And then it doesn't really matter the order of the rest of them, but you can see in this, below that I have the +1, the -1, and I make copies of those because the process involves merging images, merging layers, and you want to make sure you always have the +1 and the -1 available for further work. And I'm going to demonstrate this. So if it's confusing now, it may be less confusing when I show you how this works.
Will this presentation be available for us?
Yes,
Okay, so I don't have to take notes.
you're right. Selective gradient masking requires spending really hours making selections. Gotta be honest here. You have to select every shape in the image and then save it. And that's what takes the most time. Sometimes, I'll work for a couple hours, get tired of it, come back the next day, work for a couple more hours. And then that's just the way it is if you're going to do this technique. I've been happy with my results. So after you've made all these selections, you place a mask on the top or the medium exposure. Then you choose one of your selections and you reveal with the gradient tool the shadow, the lighter or darker image that is below. Again, it's probably not going to be clear until I demonstrate it, but I will do that. Now, the gradient tool gives you lots of different options. I use pretty much the default, which is the linear gradient tool, but there are other options with the gradient tool. But again, I use the linear. When you're doing this technique and you are enhancing the shading of these objects in your image, you need to pay attention to the direction of the light. You can't go against that. If the light's coming in from the left, you can't shade an object like it's coming in from the right. It'll look, of course, that's kind of common sense, but you do need to pay attention to that. So the image on the left kind of shows before I did the selective gradient masking on one of the silos. And then on the right, it shows after. And you can see it's exaggerated. You might ask yourself, well, why don't you just use the levels tool in Photoshop? I can tell you it's a completely different look. This gives a very unique look to the image. So I'm going to demonstrate now how this is done, I hope. So let's go to Photoshop. Hoping you're all seeing my Photoshop screen now. A little feedback. Everybody seeing my Photoshop image?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
So you can see here in my levels or layers panel, I have the main image on top. Below that, I have the +1 or extra bright image. Below that, I have the -1. And by the way, I make these images out of the original just using Lightroom. You can use any post-processing software to lighten or darken an image and then save a new copy of it. And then I have my copies down here. The first thing you want to do is put a mask on the top main image. Once you've done that, you want to go to your saved selections and load. No, I've got everything in this image is a selection. So I just want to start working on one of them. I'm going to load, let's see, the right front. So you can see now that I have loaded this selection. And below my main top medium layer is an extra light. So I'm now going to go to my gradient tool and drag across. And sometimes this takes me a few tries. And you can see right there, I went the wrong way. So the light is coming in from the left. So I want to lighten that one. So again, sometimes I have to work at it a few times to get that just right. All right, at this point, I'm just going to say I'm satisfied with that. I'm going to merge these layers. All right. Okay, and now I want to reveal some of the darker image below. I'm going to apply another mask to the main image. I'm going to reselect. And now I'm going to, that's too much. Well, that you get the idea. Sometimes I'll do that 4 or 5 times to get it exactly the way I want it to look, but that's not too far off. And of course, I have everything in this image selected. And so I will now, I would then go through every one of these silos and do that same treatment to each one of these shapes. And let's go back to so this shows you what the image looked like before, and this shows you what it looks like after.
I have a question for you, Dan.
Yeah.
After you merged those layers, how do you get the option to make use of that lighter layer again with all those other objects?
Well, do you remember that I made copies of the lighter and darker layers?
But only 2 copies.
Yeah, I just keep copying them as I work.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I just, yeah, once I always make sure to constantly recopy those layers so that I always have those below. But yeah, so
it sounds like you might want a light and a dark layer copy for every object.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
Question also.
And again, I don't work, but if you think about it, I could just go through and do all of the selections with the light layer below, just using the same layer. And then go and do all of them with the dark layer. But I go back and forth. I'm kind of a sloppy worker that way. I'm not as methodical as I might be. But another thing I want to mention is the sky in this image originally, this was not a long exposure. In fact, this was a handheld. I put in one of my skies from my sky library because if you're going to manipulate an image this much, no one's going to notice that you're dropping a sky in. So if that's a cheat, I'm fine with it. I like the way it looks.
And I have a question.
Sure.
Do you use any luminosity masks to find your selections?
I do. I am familiar with luminosity masks. I don't. And I think Susan Willen is going to be giving a presentation soon on using the pen tool. As you can see, a lot of my images involve very geometric shapes. I find that the polygonal selection tool is the one I use the most. I want very straight. Frankly, there's a lot to say about doing these selections, and I don't want to bore anybody, but when you're making these selections, you have to subtract. If anyone who's made selections, if you know what that means, you have to have a perfect border between images. You can't have any overlap in your selections or it's going to show up. So when I select one silo, and then I select the one next to it, I'll over select, and then let's say silo number 2 will be selected. Then I'll say, all right, now subtract silo number 1 so that I have a perfect selection between the two. I felt like that was confusing, but just let me say that these selections, the borders between each selection have to be identical. Does anybody want more on that? I can go back to Photoshop, but it might be a little time consuming.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
Maybe you need to do a class just on that.
Well, yeah. I will just say it takes hours. So here's a shot. This was a very long 329 seconds of the Carillon bells, which again, the selective gradient masking technique on the right. This is Dayton, 327 seconds. You can see the water really flattened out nicely. I really like the sky in this. I like this one as a color image, but I'd like it a little more as a black and white. And again, this is with the selective gradient masking. This is the Sunshine Skyway Bridge in Tampa Bay, 340 seconds. This is with the selective gradient masking technique. This is looking over the East River toward New York City. And again, 327 seconds. Look at the way the water just became totally flat. Very surreal look. And the clouds, I think, were moving toward me. So I got that kind of effect of the clouds kind of pushing out against the skyline there. This is looking toward Millennium Park in Chicago. This is with the selective gradient masking technique. This is Pritzker Pavilion, again in Millennium Park, 327 seconds. You also notice I removed that one light support bar. I just didn't like it there.
You selected each one of those buildings separately
Yes,
and then did selective gradient on each building.
yes, I did. And when you, yeah, something like this, in fact, I discovered that Photoshop has a limit as to how many selections you can save. It doesn't tell you, you've run out of saving selections, but I found out it was about 32. In some cases, I select the side of a building separately from the front because I know I want the shading to be different. So after doing this and investing all this time, I realized that if you don't really have water in your picture, you can just drop a blurred sky into any photograph. So I compiled a collection of blurred skies. Keep in mind in tripod, any sky you drop into an image must be your own sky that you have taken with your own camera. So I have a file of blurred skies that I like to use whenever I want to do this technique. This was handheld. The DP&L Tate Station, I looked at this and I thought, this looks like something out of Star Wars. What is this? And I just wanted my viewer to look at it and notice it because it's such a bizarre looking, it's a power station, but so I dropped a sky in, I did the selective gradient masking, and I think it looks like something from outer space. I don't know, it's kind of cool. This is the, again, this was the handheld picture, or I might have used a tripod, but I don't think it was a time exposure. The highways off of Washington Street, you're looking up at the 35 interchange. And that's with the selective gradient masking and a dropped in sky. And that's it. So anybody have any questions?
I might suggest if you want to do this, I use a app on my phone for determining the exposure, which is really easy to use and only costs $1. It's called ND Timer for neutral density timer. So you just enter the your shutter speed and the amount of stops in your ND filter, and it tells you how long the exposure should be. It works. It's pretty accurate.
I use paper.
The old school.
I'm old
There's
school.
several of those. I know Lee Stopper is free. and Photo Pills has that as part of it.
Has anybody else tried this kind of really long exposure stuff?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I've done quite a bit of it.
Okay, great.
I've done long exposure, but not that technique, no.
Okay. Yeah, once I got into this and I realized really the look I was going for had probably more to do with selective gradient masking than with long exposure. But
Yeah, that really sets them apart. That's
That
terrific.
really sets it apart, because I did a lot of it in Hawaii just to get the still water and the misting, but that selective gradient that you're doing is really setting them off.
yeah, it's a tedious process, but hey, it's COVID. What else do I have to do?
It's worth it. They look great.
Thank you.
So,
Some of us still have jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah, me and Judd both.
so the concept is, say I go out and I set up and take a shot. Histogram's where I want, no filters on it. So I've got, because I actually got photo pills up. So I've got my aperture, got my time and ISO. Now I put my filter on, get it dark. Then now I go in and say, okay, now what's going to be my time? Okay, but the first point, that's what you do, right? You set up, you get all your settings with no filters. Then that's your baseline data you use then to figure out.
Yes.
Okay.
You want to convert your the shutter speed without the filter
Yeah.
to what it would be with the filter. And you could use the little chart that I carry with me, or you could do some app on your phone that
Are you
all talked about.
you got a 16 stop. I got a 10 stop variable that, like somebody said, you got to have a problem. It gets an X at the end of it. But at least I can practice with it.
Yeah.
So
Well, it may be fine. I've never used the variables. Other people have. I'm
I
sure.
I think you get the,
I was gonna say, yeah, I did discover that if you use an X, if you find an X in your variable, just simply add a polarizer on top of it, because the way that they make a variable is by rotating two polarizing filters. And so if you add a third polarizer to it, it adds another stop to it, but it removes that X completely.
Okay.
I discovered that completely by accident, because that's all I had in my bag was a variable that kept doing the X every time I used it. And I slapped it onto a polarizer and suddenly the X was gone. So
yeah, when I found I used the X, it went beyond where it was supposed to go. And some of the newer ones now have a stop where you can't go beyond where you're supposed to go.
yeah, my X showed up all the way through it. And so, and I even bought a very expensive one. It wasn't a cheap one, but it just kept showing an X in various. And so when I slapped an extra polarizer filter on there and then screwed it into the polarizer, that X went away completely. So if that's all you have, then you're rescued. But I use a polarizer with a flat plate now.
Yeah.
So
And I might have concern about your masochistic tendencies.
Yeah, I'm kind of there, Dan. I wanted to chime in and say you're kind of sick, but I didn't.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you didn't say that, Judd. Thanks.
I've also stacked some of the, the 10 stop with 3 stop or something like that too. And that works.
That'll work or not. Depends on the design of the filters.
But I've found
It could
also,
surprise you desperately. So
I've had frustration with the threading. Like I said, just struggling sometimes to get the thing started and get it on there without disturbing my focus ring or my other filter. Yeah.
listen, for those of us who struggle just getting the damn camera focused,
Yeah.
putting that filter on is another huge problem,
Dan, that was a really good presentation.
Oh, thank you.
That's some really, you're really kind of going out of bounds and it's some really neat stuff there.
Well, it's kind of hard to look distinctive in this club. The competition's so tough.
Yeah, that was great.
Thank you for sharing, really.
If you're interested in filters, I found a set of very thin stackable filters so you can get many combinations. There's I think 3, 10, and 16, all 77 millimeters. I think the brand was called Ice on Amazon, and pretty inexpensive, but they have been great for me.
Yeah, because I was just doing this app and in my 10 stops, it doesn't get you. I don't think it'll get me where, like what you're doing when you're trying to get up to the 3 minutes.
Yeah.
It goes up.
You can adjust your ISO too.
Yeah, but I've got it as low as I can, so that would speed
Right.
it up. So
Might be good at dusk, maybe, and a little bit dimmer light.
yeah,
Yeah, I was surprised to get out there and find that really a 5-minute exposure required a very, very bright day with that 16 stop filter.
What ISO are you using when you do that?
100. I'm trying to keep the noise down. So. Yeah, I don't really enjoy spending hours on Photoshop. So
All evidence
anymore,
to the contrary.
I know when I look now at an image or a scene that I might want to do that treatment to, I start looking at the shapes and asking myself, do I really want to select all that? So you notice that my latest one was silos, which is compared to a city scene is pretty simple.